The soft, ambient glow of the first-class cabin was designed to soothe. It was a carefully curated world of muted grays and deep blues, of plush carpeting that swallowed sound, and seats that promised a gentle recline into oblivion. For 6-year-old Maya Vance, it was a spaceship. She pressed her nose against the triple-paned oval window, her breath fogging a small circle on the acrylic as she watched the ground crew scurry below like diligent, neon-vested ants. Her father David watched her, a tender smile touching his lips. He adjusted the cashmere blanket over her small legs, his large, gentle hands a stark contrast to the worn softness of his gray hoodie. He looked comfortable, not opulent. His jeans were clean but faded at the knees, his sneakers practical for navigating an airport with a child in tow. Beside him on the empty seat lay a handsome but understated leather portfolio, its brass clasps gleaming softly. It was the only item he owned that hinted at a world beyond simple comfort. The quiet hum of boarding was broken by a new sound, a cacophony of loud, brittle voices and the sharp clack of expensive shoes on the galley floor. The Harrington family had arrived. Richard Harrington led the charge, a man whose physical presence seemed to take up more space than he was allotted. He was broad, florid-faced, and wore a navy suit that was impeccably tailored but seemed tight around his self-importance. His watch, a block of gold and steel, caught the cabin light and threw it back with aggressive pride. Behind him trailed his wife, Eleanor, a woman sculpted from ice and disapproval, her face a mask of bored disdain. Her silk scarf was likely worth more than the monthly salary of the flight attendant, smiling nervously at her. And flanking them were their adult children, Bryce and Tiffany, perfect genetic echoes of their parents' arrogance. Bryce, with his gelled hair and sneer permanently affixed, and Tiffany, who was already raising her phone, her thumb hovering over the record button as she surveyed the cabin like a queen inspecting a lesser court. Their eyes swept the cabin and landed, as if drawn by a magnet of pure contempt, on David and Maya. Richard Harrington stopped short, his expensive loafers squeaking in protest. He looked at David, then at Maya's small form, then back at David. His gaze was an audit, a swift and brutal calculation of perceived worth. He saw a black man in a hoodie, a small child with bright, beaded braids, and he saw a problem, an error in the universe's ledger. "Excuse me," Richard boomed, not to David but to the flight attendant, a young woman named Chloe whose smile was beginning to falter. "I think there's been a mistake. These are our seats." He gestured vaguely at the row where David and Maya were settled, though his boarding pass clearly indicated the row behind them. David didn't move. He simply turned his head, his expression calm, unreadable. "I believe you'll find your seats are 3A and 3B, he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that was absorbed by the carpet and ignored by Richard. "I'm not speaking to you," Richard snapped, turning his full attention back to Chloe. "Check his ticket. There is no way he belongs here." The "he" was delivered with the force of a physical blow. It was an accusation and a verdict, all in one. Tiffany giggled, her phone now pointed directly at David. Bryce folded his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. Eleanor simply stared out the window, as if the entire exchange were a distasteful piece of modern art she was being forced to endure. Chloe, caught in the crossfire, flushed. "Sir, I can assure you all our first-class passengers are seated correctly. Perhaps if I could just see your boarding passes." "Our boarding passes are fine," Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "I want to see his boarding pass. People like him, they get confused. They wander into the wrong section of the plane. It happens." He said "people like him" with a slight, deliberate emphasis, a verbal underline that left no room for misinterpretation. David felt a familiar, weary weight settle in his chest. But on the surface, he remained a statue of tranquility. He looked at Maya, who had turned from the window, her large, dark eyes wide with confusion. She sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the way a forest creature senses an approaching storm. He gave her a small, reassuring wink, a silent promise that the monsters weren't real. "Sir," David said, his voice still impossibly level, "my daughter and I are in our assigned seats. We are not moving. I would appreciate it if you would lower your voice. You're upsetting her." The sheer audacity of the calm request seemed to enrage Richard further. "You would appreciate it? You would appreciate it?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I am a diamond medallion, 7-year, million-mile flyer with this airline. My appreciation is the only one that matters here. And I do not appreciate having to share a cabin with stowaways." The word hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Chloe gasped. Another passenger in the row ahead turned to stare, her expression horrified. Tiffany's phone was still recording, a tiny red light blinking with malevolent glee. "Sir, that is entirely uncalled for," Chloe said, her training finally kicking in, her voice trembling but firm. "I want him removed," Richard declared, pointing a thick finger at David. "I don't feel safe. He's being aggressive." It was a masterful, despicable move. The inversion of reality. David, who had not moved a muscle, who had spoken in tones barely above a whisper, was now painted as the aggressor. The man bellowing and pointing was the victim. David slowly reached for his boarding pass on the console, but his fingers brushed against the cool leather of the portfolio beside him. He paused. He thought of the years of work inside it, the sleepless nights, the dizzying numbers, the elegant lines of a future he had drawn with his own hands. He thought of the promise he had made to his daughter that they would see the ocean from their hotel room. He had endured moments like this his entire life, 1,000 tiny cuts of prejudice and assumption, but not in front of Maya, not today. He looked at Richard Harrington, whose face was now a mask of smug certainty. He looked at Eleanor's silent complicity, at Bryce's cruel amusement, at Tiffany's vapid voyeurism. They were a monolith of arrogance, a fortress of presumed superiority, and they thought he was nothing. A stray piece of luggage that had ended up in the wrong place. They had no idea the storm they were so determined to unleash. They couldn't possibly know that in a matter of hours, their entire world, built on a foundation of condescension and unearned confidence, was about to be leveled. This is the kind of story that gets under your skin, isn't it? That feeling of injustice just boils up. We've all seen someone like that, someone who thinks their money or their status makes them better than everyone else. If you're already feeling that fire for David, do me a favor and hit that like button. It lets me know you're right here with me on this journey. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. All right, stick with me. The humiliation is tough, but I promise you the payoff is worth every second. The situation escalated with the practiced, chilling efficiency of a procedure that had been enacted before. Chloe, the flight attendant, spoke into her handset in a hushed, urgent tone. Her eyes kept flitting back to David, a mixture of apology and fear in them. She was young, out of her depth, and had defaulted to the path of least resistance. Appease the loud, important-looking man. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the cabin door. They were large men, their uniforms crisp, their faces impassive. They moved with a stolid, heavy-footed deliberateness that instantly changed the cabin's atmosphere from tense to critical. "Sir, would you mind coming with us?" the taller of the 2 officers asked David. It wasn't a question. David looked at the officers, then at the triumphant sneer on Richard Harrington's face. Tiffany had lowered her phone slightly, but the red light was still on, capturing this moment of perceived victory. Bryce leaned back in his newly acquired seat, one David had just been occupying, and stretched his legs out, the picture of entitled ease. "On what grounds?" David asked. His voice was still calm, but there was a new edge to it now, a shard of steel beneath the velvet. "I have a valid ticket. I have not raised my voice. I have not threatened anyone." "The captain has been informed that there is a disturbance," the officer said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A passenger has raised a concern for their safety. We need you to deplane so we can sort this out." "He raised a concern for his safety?" David repeated, letting the absurdity of the statement hang in the air. He gestured with his chin toward Richard, who was now busy directing his wife where to stow her carry-on, as if the matter were already concluded. "This man has verbally assaulted me in front of my child, used racist innuendo, and falsely accused me of being a threat, and I am the one being removed?" Maya, sensing the finality of the officer's presence, began to cry. Not loudly, but with quiet, heart-wrenching sobs that shook her small shoulders. "Daddy, I don't want to go," she whispered, her tiny hand clutching his sleeve. That was the sound that broke through David's composure. A fissure appeared in his calm facade, revealing the raw, protective fury of a father. But his voice, when he spoke, was still controlled. He turned to Maya, cupping her face in his hands. "Hey, Starlight, it's okay. We're just going to go with these men for a minute. It's a misunderstanding. We'll be right back, I promise." He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You be brave for me, okay?" She nodded, trying to stifle her sobs. David stood up. He was taller than both officers, with a lean, powerful build that his simple clothes did not entirely conceal. He moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to rebuke the entire sordid scene. He picked up his worn backpack, but he paused, his hand hovering over the leather portfolio. For a second he considered leaving it, but then, with a deliberate motion, he picked it up, tucking it securely under his arm. It was a part of him. It was the proof of who he was, and he would not be separated from it. As he and Maya started to walk down the aisle, a collective sigh of relief seemed to emanate from the Harrington family. "About time," Bryce muttered. Tiffany watched them go, a smug smile on her face as she finally stopped recording. The walk was a gauntlet of shame. Passengers in business and economy class stared as David, his daughter, and their two-man escort passed. They saw a black man being removed from first class by security. They drew their own conclusions, swift and damning. David could feel their gazes on his back, a physical weight of judgment. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his hand resting protectively on Maya's shoulder. He focused on the rhythmic squeak of his sneakers on the floor, the scent of recycled air, the feel of the portfolio's cool leather against his ribs. He was building a wall inside his mind, brick by brick, against the humiliation. At the jet bridge door, he paused and looked back. He saw Chloe, the flight attendant, avoiding his gaze, her face pale. He saw Richard Harrington accepting a glass of champagne from another flight attendant, laughing and holding it up in a silent toast to his wife. They were celebrating. They had successfully cleansed their gilded cage of his presence. The injustice was a physical thing, a hot, metallic taste in his mouth. It would have been so easy to lose his temper, to shout, to give them the very aggression they had falsely accused him of. But that was their game, not his. Patience was a weapon. Strategy was a shield. His father had taught him that. "Never fight on their terms," he'd said. "Make them come to yours." As the security officers led him, and a still sniffling Maya, off the jet bridge and into the terminal, the door to the plane hissed shut behind them. The sound was like a final verdict. To everyone on that plane, the story was over. The problem had been removed. The flight would now depart, and the incident would become a mildly amusing anecdote for the Harringtons to tell at their next country club dinner. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the story wasn't over. The door closing wasn't an ending. It was the beginning. David Vance, holding his daughter's hand and clutching a leather portfolio, was not retreating. He was simply repositioning his pieces on the board, and his next move would change the entire game. They weren't taken to a stark interrogation room, as David might have expected. Instead, the security officers escorted him and Maya to a quiet, discreetly luxurious lounge tucked away behind an unmarked door near the gate. It was one of the airline's elite services rooms, reserved for lost potentates and inconvenienced celebrities. The irony was so thick David could have choked on it. The room had plush armchairs, a polished mahogany table, and a small fridge stocked with sparkling water and juice. It was a cage, but a gilded one. One of the officers, the taller one who had spoken on the plane, gestured to a chair. "Please have a seat, Mr. Vance. Someone will be with you shortly." He had David's boarding pass in his hand. He had a name now, not just a description. A small shift. "And my daughter?" David asked, his voice low. "She can stay with you, of course." The officer seemed slightly uncomfortable now that the public spectacle was over. "There's juice in the fridge, if she'd like some." David nodded, his face unreadable. He settled Maya into a large armchair, her small feet dangling far above the floor. He knelt before her, taking her small hands in his. "See? I told you it was okay. How about an apple juice while we wait?" Maya looked around the strange, quiet room. "Are we still going to see the ocean, Daddy?" Her voice was small, fragile. "Yes, Starlight," David said, his voice full of a conviction he willed into existence. "We are absolutely still going to see the ocean, I promise." He got her a juice box, and as she focused on poking the straw through the foil top, he walked to the other side of the room and pulled out his phone. He stood with his back to the officers, who were lingering by the door, speaking in low murmurs. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name for a moment before he pressed it. The call connected on the first ring. "Marcus," David said, his voice low and tight. "I have a situation." He proceeded to explain, in clipped, precise sentences, exactly what had happened. There was no emotion in his voice, only the cold, clear transmission of information. He related Richard Harrington's words, the accusations, the removal from the plane. He gave him the flight number, the gate number, and the names of the family, which he had overheard during their loud pronouncements of status. "The flight is still at the gate," David finished. "They haven't pushed back yet." He listened for a moment, his eyes fixed on a bland corporate painting on the wall. "Yes," he said, "that's the one. Harrington Construction. I thought the name sounded familiar. No, I don't want them simply removed. This isn't about an eye for an eye, Marcus. This is about a standard, a message. Yes, I have the portfolio with me." "Understood." He ended the call without another word. Meanwhile, back on Flight 815, the first-class cabin had settled into a state of smug tranquility. The Harringtons were on their second glass of champagne. Richard was holding court, his voice once again booming through the quiet space. "You simply have to be firm," he was explaining to the passenger across the aisle, who was trying very hard to read his book. "These airlines, they're so worried about appearances they let standards slip. You let one in, the whole place goes downhill. It's about maintaining a certain quality of experience." "He had a child with him," the other passenger said quietly, not looking up from his page. "Exactly," Richard exclaimed, completely missing the man's point. "What kind of person exposes a child to that kind of situation? Trying to sneak into a place they don't belong. It's irresponsible." Tiffany was editing the video she had taken, adding a filter and typing out a caption. "Some people have no class. Had to have this guy removed from our flight. Hashtag first class problems. Hashtag travel drama. Hashtag entitlement." She was trying to decide which emojis to use. A laughing face? An eye roll? The minutes ticked by. 10, 15. The cabin door remained shut, the jet bridge still attached. The initial feeling of victory began to curdle into impatience. "What's the holdup?" Bryce asked, craning his neck to look toward the cockpit. "Don't tell me that bum is causing a paperwork delay." "Probably," Richard grumbled, draining his champagne. "Probably trying to file some frivolous complaint. People like that are always looking for a handout." Up in the cockpit, Captain Eva Rostova was looking at her flight plan. A blinking light on her console indicated a manifest discrepancy. A passenger checked in but not on board. Another passenger boarded but not checked in. It was a mess. She buzzed the lead flight attendant. "Chloe, what's the story with the passenger list?" Her voice was crisp, with the faint, clipped accent of her native Poland. "I have a David Vance removed, but no record of why. And I have 4 Harringtons who seem to have moved seats. Clean it up. We're already 20 minutes behind schedule." "Captain," Chloe's voice was thin, nervous. "There was a confrontation. A passenger was being disruptive." "Disruptive how?" The other passengers, the Harringtons, they felt he was a threat." Captain Rostova paused. She'd been a pilot for 22 years. She'd dealt with drunkards, belligerents, and genuine security threats. She knew what a disruptive passenger felt like, and it rarely aligned with the complaints of status-obsessed flyers. "Put a note in the log. What was the specific threat?" There was a long pause. "He was very quiet, Captain," Chloe finally admitted. "But Mr. Harrington felt he was aggressive." Rostova's eyes narrowed. This smelled wrong. It smelled of entitlement, not danger. "Hold on, push back," she commanded. "I'll be out in a minute." She hung up and looked at the manifest again. Vance, David. The name pinged a distant bell in her memory. She'd seen it recently, in a high-level company memo, a very important one. It was attached to a project she was personally excited about, a project that was going to define the future of the airline. She pulled out her company-issued tablet and typed the name into the internal search engine. The result came back instantly, a picture of a smiling, confident black man in a sharp suit standing next to the CEO of the airline. The headline read, "Vance Architects to Helm LAX Area Terminal Project." Captain Eva Rostova stared at the screen. Then she stared at the manifest discrepancy report. Then she looked through the cockpit window, down the jet bridge toward the terminal. A slow, cold anger began to build within her. They had removed the architect of their own multi-billion-dollar future from a first-class seat because he was wearing a hoodie. "Get me airport operations," she said to her first officer, her voice dangerously calm. "And get me the head of corporate security, now." Captain Rostova unbuckled her harness and stood up, her movements precise and economical. She was not a tall woman, but she carried an authority that seemed to add inches to her stature. Her uniform was immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on her epaulets gleaming. She smoothed the front of her jacket and stepped out of the cockpit, her face a granite mask of controlled fury. The first-class cabin fell silent as she entered. All eyes turned to her. The pilot emerging from the cockpit before takeoff was never a casual occurrence. It meant something was wrong. Richard Harrington, who had been loudly complaining to Chloe about the delay, immediately shut his mouth. He recognized true authority when he saw it, and it was not wearing a flight attendant's uniform. "Good afternoon," Captain Rostova said, her voice cutting through the cabin's tense quiet. It was not a warm greeting. "We have a delay. I am here to understand why." She didn't look at the whole cabin. Her gaze, a pair of piercing blue lasers, settled directly on Richard Harrington. "Sir," she began, "I am Captain Eva Rostova. I am in command of this aircraft. I've been informed that a passenger was removed at your request." Richard puffed out his chest, sensing an opportunity to reassert his importance. "That's correct, Captain. Had to be done. The man was being aggressive, unstable. My family and I felt threatened." "Threatened," Captain Rostova repeated. The word was flat, a dead weight in the air. "Please describe the specific threats he made." "Well, Richard faltered for a fraction of a second. It was easy to use words like aggressive and threatening as vague bludgeons. It was harder to provide concrete evidence. It was his demeanor, his tone. He was very confrontational when we pointed out he was in the wrong seats. "Were those your seats, Mr. Harrington?" Captain Rostova asked, her eyes unblinking. "My manifest shows your assigned seats were 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D. The passenger you had removed, Mr. Vance, was in his assigned seat, 2B. His daughter was in 2A. The cabin was now so quiet that the faint hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed like a roar. Richard's florid face began to deepen in color. There was confusion about the seating. The point is, he became belligerent. Belligerent, the captain echoed, her voice laced with ice. She turned her gaze to Tiffany, who shrank back in her seat. I understand you were recording the incident. Perhaps your video would shed some light on Mr. Vance's belligerence? Tiffany's eyes went wide with panic. The video she'd been so proud of moments before now felt like a piece of damning evidence. I didn't, it was just she stammered, fumbling for her phone. Let me be more specific, Mr. Harrington, Captain Rostova continued, turning her attention back to the patriarch. Did he raise his voice? My lead flight attendant reported that Mr. Vance was quiet. It was a quiet aggression, Richard insisted, his voice rising in frustration. It's a type of intimidation. You have to be able to read these situations, Captain. I have been flying for 22 years, Mr. Harrington, she replied, her voice dropping to a dangerously low level. I have been trained by air marshals, by security experts, and by psychologists to read these situations. I have faced down hijackers, medical emergencies, and bomb threats, and I am very, very good at telling the difference between a genuine threat and a rich man having a tantrum because he doesn't like the look of his neighbor. The insult was so direct, so perfectly delivered, that for a moment, Richard Harrington was speechless. His mouth opened and closed like a beached fish. Eleanor, for the first time, looked genuinely alarmed, placing a restraining hand on her husband's arm. Captain Rostova wasn't finished. She let the silence stretch, forcing the Harringtons to stew in it. Her eyes swept over the other passengers, who were now watching the scene with rapt attention. The man who had been trying to read his book was now looking at Richard Harrington with open disgust. A man and his 6-year-old daughter were humiliated and removed from this aircraft because you didn't like his demeanor, the captain stated, framing each word in contempt. This has caused a significant delay. It has required the intervention of airport security. It has necessitated a review of this flight's safety clearance, all because of a feeling you had. She took a step closer, her voice now barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the cabin. So I am going to ask you one more time, Mr. Harrington, and I advise you to choose your next words with the utmost care. What, specifically, did David Vance do to threaten you? Just then, the hiss of the cabin door opening broke the tension. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stepped aboard. He had the anxious, focused energy of a high-level executive. He was the airline's director of airport operations for the Western region, a man named Jonathan Davies, and right behind him, holding his daughter's hand, was David Vance. David had taken off his hoodie. He was now wearing a crisp, dark blue button-down shirt that had been in his backpack. He had smoothed his hair, and the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a calm, unyielding focus. He still held the leather portfolio. He looked, in that moment, not like a man who had been unjustly removed, but like a man who had come to take ownership of the room. The transformation was stunning. He was no longer the man in the hoodie. He was David Vance, and he was back on his terms. The collective gasp in the first-class cabin was audible. The Harrington family stared, their faces a tableau of disbelief. It was as if a ghost had just walked back into the room, except this ghost was now flanked by a man who radiated corporate authority. Richard Harrington was the first to recover, his mind scrambling to process this new, unwelcome reality. He saw David, not in the hoodie of the presumed interloper, but in the attire of a professional, a peer. His brain, so accustomed to sorting the world into neat boxes of status, was short-circuiting. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard blustered, turning his anger from the captain to the newly arrived executive. "I had this man removed. He's a security risk." Jonathan Davies, the airline director, ignored him completely. His attention was focused solely on David. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice laced with a deep and profound apology. "On behalf of the entire airline, I am so sorry. This is an unacceptable failure of our standards and our service. We are launching a full investigation." David nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away. "Thank you, Mr. Davies." His gaze swept over the Harringtons, lingering for a moment on each of their stunned faces before coming to rest on Richard. There was no anger in his eyes, only a sort of detached clinical observation. It was far more unnerving than rage. "Mr. Vance?" Richard sputtered, the name sounding foreign and wrong on his tongue. "Who is Mr. Vance?" Captain Rostova answered, her voice ringing with satisfaction. "Mr. Harrington, allow me to introduce David Vance. He is one of our most valued partners." Davies stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between David and the Harringtons. The symbolic gesture was unmistakable. "Mr. Harrington, my name is Jonathan Davies. I'm the Director of Operations here. I was alerted to this incident by our executive team, who were contacted by Mr. Vance's office." "His office?" Bryce muttered, a sliver of doubt finally piercing his smugness. Davies continued, his voice cold and professional. "Mr. Harrington, you mentioned your status as a million-mile flyer. You are indeed a frequent customer, which makes it all the more surprising that you aren't familiar with the future of this airline, a future that Mr. Vance here is designing." He paused, letting the statement sink in. The other passengers were leaning forward now, utterly captivated. "I'm not sure I follow," Richard said, his bluster deflating rapidly, replaced by a creeping dread. "Let me make it plain," Davies said. He gestured toward David. "This is Mr. David Vance, the founder and lead architect of Vance Architectural Design. He is, by universal acclaim, one of the most innovative architects in the world, specializing in public transit and aviation infrastructure. You may have heard of his work on the new terminals in Singapore and Dubai." The names landed like explosions in the silent cabin. Even the Harringtons, in their bubble of self-interest, knew those projects. They were legendary, monuments of glass and steel and light that had redefined the travel experience. Davies wasn't done. He saved the most devastating blow for last. "For the past 18 months, Mr. Vance and his firm have been working on the single largest capital investment this airline has ever made: the design and construction of the new Area International Terminal at LAX, a $2.7 billion project." David, who had been silent throughout this, lifted the leather portfolio. He didn't open it, he just held it, the symbolic object. "The final schematic and materials proposal," he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "I was flying out to present it to the board tomorrow morning." The blood drained from Richard Harrington's face. He looked at the portfolio, then at David, and the final, catastrophic piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Harrington Construction, his company. For the better part of a year, his entire team had been working feverishly, spending millions on preliminary studies and proposals to win the primary construction contract for the area terminal. It was the kind of legacy project that could elevate his company from a successful regional player to a global powerhouse. His entire future, the culmination of his life's work, was tied to that contract. And the man who held the keys to that future, the man whose vision would decide who was qualified to build his masterpiece, was the same man he had just had humiliated and thrown off a plane for wearing a hoodie. "Oh, God," Richard whispered, the words escaping his lips in a choked breath. He stumbled back, collapsing into his seat. He looked at his wife, his children, as if seeing them for the first time, seeing them as accomplices in his own spectacular ruin. Eleanor's mask of icy composure finally cracked. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Bryce looked as if he'd been punched in the stomach. And Tiffany, the social media documentarian, slowly, shakily, deleted the video from her phone, her face ashen. The hashtag travel drama she was so eager to share had just become her own family's tragedy. The quiet, underestimated man they had tried to crush had just revealed himself to be the architect of their destiny, and they had, with their own blind arrogance, dynamited the foundations. The silence that followed the revelation was profound. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of the first-class cabin. The Harringtons were frozen, trapped in a moment of horrifying clarity. They were seeing themselves through David's eyes, through the eyes of the other passengers, and the image being reflected back was grotesque. Richard was the first to break, scrambling to his feet with a desperate, clumsy energy. The sneering, confident titan of industry was gone, replaced by a pleading, terrified man. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice thick with a sycophantic panic. "Mr. Vance, David, my God, this is a terrible misunderstanding, a truly awful, terrible mistake." He took a step toward David, his hands outstretched as if in supplication. David didn't flinch, didn't move back. He simply stood there, a calm, immovable object, his daughter Maya now holding his hand, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet curiosity as she watched the man who had been so loud and mean suddenly seem so small. "A misunderstanding," David repeated, his voice still quiet, yet it seemed to shake the very air. "I don't think so, Mr. Harrington. I think it was a moment of perfect understanding. You understood that I was a black man in a hoodie, and you understood that gave you the right to treat me as less than human. You understood that my daughter's tears were less important than your desire for an empty seat next to you. You understood that your status gave you the power to have me publicly humiliated and removed from a flight I paid for. What part did I misunderstand?" This was the moral mirror. David wasn't shouting. He was simply listing the facts, holding up a polished reflection of Richard's own behavior. Each calm, measured sentence was another turn of the screw. No, you don't understand," Richard stammered, his face slick with sweat. I wasn't. It was a mistake. I'm not a racist, man. My company has diversity initiatives. We donate to charities." He was flailing, throwing out anything he could think of to stop his world from collapsing. "Please, the contract. My company. We've put everything into this bid. It's the best bid, you'll see. The best materials, the best team." He was trying to make a business pitch, a desperate, last-ditch effort to salvage the deal, completely failing to grasp that the damage was not commercial, but moral. "The contract?" David said, a flicker of something, not quite anger, more like profound disappointment in his eyes. "You think this is about the contract now? You think you can buy your way out of this with a good bid?" Eleanor finally found her voice, a strained, brittle thing. "What my husband means to say, Mr. Vance, is that we are deeply, deeply sorry for our behavior. It was inexcusable. We were tired from traveling. It's no excuse, I know, but we weren't ourselves." "Weren't yourselves?" David countered, turning his calm gaze on her. "I disagree. I think in moments like that we are precisely ourselves. We are who we are when we think no one important is watching." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed facade of gentility crumbled into dust. She had been complicit, her silence a form of gasoline on her husband's fire. Bryce, seeing his father's pathetic pleading fail, tried a different tactic, belligerent denial. "This is entrapment. You knew who we were. You set us up." Jonathan Davies, the airline director, stepped forward again. "That's enough, Mr. Harrington," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He looked at Bryce with pure disgust. "Mr. Vance has done nothing but exhibit a level of dignity and restraint that is frankly astonishing under the circumstances. The only people who set you up were yourselves." Davies then turned to Richard. "Mr. Harrington, the bidding process for the area terminal includes a standard ethics and conduct clause. It stipulates that all potential partners must adhere to principles of respect, integrity, and professionalism, not just in their formal proposals, but in all their dealings. It is there to ensure we partner with companies that reflect our own core values. He let that hang in the air for a beat. You, sir, have just demonstrated in the most public and spectacular way imaginable that your values are fundamentally incompatible with ours. Richard's face went white. He understood what was coming. As of this moment, Davies announced, his voice ringing with finality, Harrington Construction's bid for the area terminal project is permanently and irrevocably disqualified from consideration. Furthermore, based on your behavior, your family's diamond medallion status is hereby revoked. A full report of this incident will be logged. Our legal team will be in touch. It was a complete and total demolition. In the space of 5 minutes, Richard Harrington had lost the contract of a lifetime, his privileged status with the airline, and any shred of dignity he had left. He stood there, swaying slightly, a ruined man in an expensive suit, the architect of his own destruction. The quiet bomb had detonated, and the fallout was catastrophic. The aftermath was swift and mercilessly efficient. The dream of the area terminal, the jewel in the crown of his career, had vanished. The revocation of his medallion status, a symbol of privilege he had wielded like a scepter for years, was a petty but deeply cutting insult. The threat of legal contact was a dark cloud on an already apocalyptic horizon. Richard Harrington had played a high-stakes game of status and lost everything in a single, disastrous hand. "You can't do this," he whispered, the words devoid of their earlier force. It was the plea of a man falling, grasping at empty air. "It's already done," Mr. Davies replied, his tone clinical. "Now, I have one more matter to attend to." He turned to Chloe, the young flight attendant who had initiated the call to security. She had been standing near the galley, watching the entire drama unfold, her face growing paler with each new revelation. She looked as if she were about to be physically ill. "Chloe," Davies said, his voice softer now, but still firm, "report to my office at the terminal as soon as we land. We will be reviewing your handling of this situation in detail." The implication was clear. Her judgment was in question, her career hanging by a thread. Appeasing the loud, wealthy passenger had been the easy choice, and it had proven to be the catastrophically wrong one. She nodded mutely, her eyes filled with tears. Davies then turned his attention back to the Harringtons. "Captain Rostova has made a decision. Given the extreme nature of your misconduct and the distress you have caused to another passenger and the crew, you and your family will not be flying with us today. You are being deplaned." The parallel was so perfect, so poetically just, it was almost beautiful. The very fate they had inflicted upon David was now being visited upon them. "You're kicking us off the flight," Tiffany shrieked, the first sound she had made since her panicked deletion of the video. The injustice of it, from her perspective, was staggering. "But we have a connecting flight. We have reservations." "I suggest you make alternative arrangements," Davies said flatly. He nodded to the 2 security officers who had been waiting quietly by the door, the same 2 officers who had escorted David off the plane. "Please escort the Harringtons back to the terminal." The officers stepped forward. The walk of shame was about to begin, but this time the casting was reversed. Richard didn't move. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. He looked at David, one last desperate appeal in his eyes. "Please," he said, the word barely audible. "My company, my family." David looked at the broken man before him. He felt no triumph, no glee. There was a profound sadness in the moment, a deep and aching pity for the hollowness of a life built on such brittle foundations. He thought of his daughter, of the lesson he would have to teach her from this ugly episode. He could be cruel. He could be vindictive. He could savor this victory. But that would make him like them. "Your family is your responsibility, Mr. Harrington," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just as my family is mine. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. He turned slightly, presenting his back to Richard, a clear and final dismissal. The conversation was over. The Harringtons were herded to their feet. Eleanor, her face a frozen mask of humiliation, refused to look at anyone. Bryce was sullen and angry, muttering under his breath. Tiffany was openly crying, not out of remorse, but out of pure, selfish indignation. Richard walked like a zombie, his expensive suit now looking like a costume for a part he could no longer play. As they walked down the aisle, the same aisle David had walked just an hour before, the other passengers did not stare with condemnation. They stared with a kind of quiet awe at the justice they had just witnessed. They watched as the family, who had boarded with such loud and obnoxious confidence, were now being led away in disgrace. The door hissed open, they were ushered out, and the door hissed shut. The silence returned, but this time it was a clean, peaceful silence. The toxic presence had been purged. Mr. Davies turned to David. "Mr. Vance, your seats." He gestured to 2A and 2B, where the Harringtons' discarded belongings still lay. A flight attendant quickly and discreetly removed them. "Thank you," David said. He led Maya back to her window seat. She immediately pressed her nose back to the glass, as if no time had passed at all. For a child, the world could reset itself with astonishing speed. Captain Rostova approached him. "Mr. Vance," she said, extending a hand. "I am Eva Rostova. It is an honor to have you on my flight, and I apologize for my crew's role in this." David shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip. "Captain, you have nothing to apologize for. You upheld the highest standard of your profession. You sought the truth. Thank you." Her stern face broke into a small, genuine smile. "We try," she said. She then addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now cleared for departure." A ripple of applause went through the cabin, not for the departure, but for her, for him, for the small, satisfying restoration of order and decency in their shared metal tube, 30,000 feet in the air. David settled into his seat, the plush leather feeling different now. It wasn't just a comfortable chair. It was a seat he had earned and defended and reclaimed. He looked at Maya, happily watching the ground crew again, and felt the hot knot of anger in his chest finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, weary, but profound sense of peace. The resolution settled over the first-class cabin like a warm blanket. The engines spooled up with a low, powerful hum, a sound of purpose and forward motion. The plane pushed back from the gate, leaving the drama, the humiliation, and the disgraced Harrington family behind on the tarmac of their own making. Mr. Davies had departed with a final, sincere apology to David, promising a personal follow-up from the CEO. Captain Rostova was back in the cockpit, her voice coming over the intercom with its usual crisp professionalism to announce their flight time and route, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened at all. The remaining passengers settled in, a quiet camaraderie now existing between them. They had been witnesses to a moral play, and its just conclusion had left them with a shared sense of satisfaction. David leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes for a moment. The adrenaline that had coursed through him for the past hour began to recede, leaving a profound weariness in its wake. There was no elation in Richard Harrington's ruin. David had not sought revenge. He had sought respect. He had not wanted to destroy a man. He had wanted to defend his own dignity, and more importantly, the world his daughter was learning to navigate. Maya tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, is the mean man gone?" David opened his eyes and turned to her. He saw the day's events reflected in her wide, intelligent eyes. This was the most important debriefing. "Yes, Starlight, he's gone." "Why was he so angry?" she asked, a question so simple and yet so complex. David thought for a moment, choosing his words with the same care he would use to place a crucial beam in one of his designs. "Sometimes people build their houses on weak ground, Maya. They think that having fancy things or loud voices makes their house strong. But it doesn't. It's just a show. And they get scared and angry when they see someone in a strong house that they don't understand. "Is our house strong?" she asked. "Our house is very strong," David said, smiling, "because it's not built from things you can buy. It's built from kindness and respect and knowing who we are inside. No one can ever knock that down." He hoped the lesson would stick, a small seed of resilience planted in the fertile ground of her young mind. A flight attendant approached, a different one this time, older and with kind eyes. It was the purser, the lead attendant for the entire flight. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, "my name is Margaret. I am so terribly sorry for what you and your daughter experienced. It never should have happened. Is there anything at all I can get for you? A meal for your daughter? Perhaps a glass of something for you? We have a 2008 Dom Perignon that I believe has your name on it." David smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "I think my daughter would love some ice cream if that's possible. And for me," he looked out the window as the plane taxied onto the runway, "just some water, please. I have a long day tomorrow." The purser nodded. "Of course, and for what it's worth from the entire crew, thank you. You taught a valuable lesson to a lot of people today." As she walked away, the man in the seat across the aisle, the one who had been trying to read his book, leaned over. "I just wanted to say, I'm a lawyer. I saw the whole thing. If you need a witness for anything, anything at all, here's my card." He passed a business card to David. "Thank you," David said, accepting it. "I appreciate that." The engines roared to life, pressing them all back into their seats. The plane accelerated down the runway, a surge of raw power, and then, with a feeling of impossible grace, it lifted into the air. The ground fell away. The terminal, the cars, the entire world of the conflict shrank until it was just a part of the vast tapestry of the city below. David watched it go, feeling a sense of detachment. The Harringtons were down there somewhere, dealing with the wreckage of their day, their company, their lives. He wondered if they would learn anything from it. Would Richard Harrington ever look at a person in a hoodie and see anything other than his own prejudice? Would Eleanor ever find the courage to speak up against her husband's cruelty? Would their children ever develop a sense of empathy? He doubted it. Some structures are built too poorly to be renovated. They can only be demolished. His own structure, however, felt sound. The incident had tested its foundations, but they had held. He had protected his daughter. He had maintained his integrity. He hadn't stooped to their level. He had simply revealed the truth and allowed the consequences to follow their natural, just course. As the plane banked over the coastline, the Pacific Ocean came into view, a vast, glittering expanse of blue under the afternoon sun. "Daddy, look!" Maya cried, her face alight with pure joy. "It's the ocean! You promised!" David looked at his daughter, then at the endless horizon. "I know, Starlight," he whispered, putting his arm around her. "I always keep my promises." The new dynamics were set. The world felt a little more ordered, a little more just. The flight continued, soaring high above the clouds, carrying a father and his daughter toward a well-deserved vacation, and leaving the consequences to rain down on those who had earned them below. The rest of the flight passed in a cocoon of tranquility. Maya, after enjoying a surprisingly large bowl of vanilla ice cream with chocolate sauce, fell asleep against his arm, her breathing soft and even. The tension of the day had exhausted her. David watched her sleep, her small face peaceful in the dim cabin light, and felt a wave of love so fierce it was almost painful. Everything he did, every battle he fought, was for her. It was to build a world for her where she would be judged not by the texture of her hair or the color of her skin, but by the strength of her character and the brilliance of her mind. He opened his leather portfolio. The crisp, heavy paper of the architectural drawings felt cool and solid beneath his fingertips. He looked at the elegant lines of the area terminal, the soaring glass canopy designed to mimic an ocean wave, the sustainable energy systems, the intuitive, human-centric flow of the spaces. It was more than a building. It was a statement. It was a testament to the idea that public spaces should be uplifting, that they should bring people together, not wall them off. It was, in its own way, the architectural embodiment of the very principles the Harringtons had so violently rejected. He thought about Harrington Construction. He knew their bid. It had been technically proficient, but soulless. It was all about cost-cutting and maximizing square footage, a spreadsheet rendered in concrete and steel. It had no vision, no poetry. It was a reflection of its founder, pragmatic, aggressive, and utterly devoid of grace. Even if the incident on the plane had never happened, David knew in his heart he could never have chosen them. Their work lacked the one essential ingredient he valued above all others: humanity. The disqualification wasn't just punishment, it was a necessary culling. The area terminal deserved a builder who understood its soul, not just its budget. Marcus, his business partner and lawyer, would have already initiated the process of moving to the next candidate on their shortlist, a firm run by a woman David deeply respected, whose work was known for its quality and its ethical labor practices. The project would be in better hands. Justice in this case was also good business. He spent the next few hours making notes, refining details, preparing for the board meeting. The work focused him, centered him. It was his sanctuary. In the clean, logical world of lines and angles and stress calculations, there were no prejudices, only problems to be solved. It was a relief. As they began their descent into Hawaii, the setting sun painted the clouds in spectacular hues of orange and purple. David gently woke Maya. "Hey, Starlight, we're almost there." She blinked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and then gasped as she saw the volcanic islands rising from the deep blue sea. "It's magic," she whispered. "It is," David agreed. The landing was smooth. As they deplaned, the warm, humid air of the island, fragrant with flowers, greeted them like a welcome embrace. The tension of the Los Angeles terminal felt a world away. There were no stairs here, only the friendly alohas of the airport staff. In his pocket, David's phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "CEO of Atlantic Charter called. Wants to meet you personally on your return. Offered lifetime first-class travel for you and your daughter. Also, word travels fast. The board of a major construction conglomerate just called Richard Harrington in for an emergency performance review. Their stock is down 8% in after-hours trading. Looks like your little flight delay is making waves." David read the message and felt a small, grim smile touch his lips. The consequences were rippling outwards, far beyond the confines of that airplane. A man's character, or lack thereof, was not a private matter. In the interconnected world of modern business, reputation was everything, and Richard Harrington had just torched his own. He tucked his phone away. That was Harrington's story now, not his. His story was here, on this island, with his daughter. They collected their bags and stepped out into the warm evening. A car was waiting for them, as arranged. The driver, a friendly local man, loaded their luggage. "Welcome to paradise, Mr. Vance," the driver said. As they drove toward the hotel, with the windows down and the sweet island air washing over them, Maya rested her head on his shoulder. "Daddy," she said sleepily, "I love our strong house." David kissed the top of her head. "Me too, Starlight. Me too." The moral of the story wasn't complicated. It wasn't some grand philosophical treatise. It was simple. It was a truth that every child understands before the world teaches them to forget it. Be kind. Treat people with respect. Your true worth is not in your bank account or your job title, but in how you treat the person next to you, whether they're in a suit or a hoodie. The Harringtons had forgotten that simple truth, and it had cost them everything. David had held on to it, even when it was hard, and it had proven to be the strongest foundation of all. The ocean awaited, vast and deep and real, a world away from the shallow illusions of status and power. The lesson was learned, the storm had passed, and now there was only peace. This story really is a testament to the power of dignity, isn't it? David never had to raise his voice. He never had to get cruel. He just had to be himself, and the world realigned around his integrity. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about how loud you can shout, but about the quiet confidence of knowing your own worth. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe in the kind of justice we saw today, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories that I hope will inspire and empower you. Thank you for being here, for watching, and for being part of this community. Until next time, remember to be the kind of person who builds strong houses.